Steven Ciobo fits that bill. He's the Parliamentary Secretary to the Treasurer. Welcome, Steve. You must also feel that you're a bit like a policeman or a fireman on all hours call-out duties. Just tell us about what your role has been so far.
Well, look, of course, there's a aspect of it that's a formal process, and so there's been the opportunity to go out to the airport, as I and a number of other colleagues have done over the past 24, 48 hours, just to officially welcome guests to Australia. They want to know, of course, that they're going to be met and officially greeted, and we've been doing that both with heads of state as well as some others, such as the multilateral banks, for example. Christine Lagarde from the IMF yesterday morning, Jim Kim, the president of the World Bank, this morning. So there is a lot of activity going on.
And that's a massive logistical exercise. So far, it all seems to be going pretty smoothly. Indeed, maybe too smoothly. Could one observation be made that this is the summit that has cleared a city? Where are the people?
Well, look, I think really this is the culmination of literally more than a year's planning. I had the Treasurer and I went through for a walk through the Brisbane Convention Centre yesterday and spoke with hundreds of volunteers. I mean, Australians from the length and breadth of this country are really putting their shoulder to the wheel, and that's the reason why it's all going so well thus far, and I'm sure it will continue to go so well. In terms of Brisbane residents, look, they'll make a decision about whether they want to stay in the city or head out. Obviously, a large number have chosen to go to the Gold Coast or the Sunshine Coast for the long weekend.
It feels a little soulless in that respect, but I suppose it makes it easier for the security operations that the place has been largely cleared out. Was jawboning people to go away and take some time off? Was that part of the planning process?
No, we want to make sure that businesses in the city are open. We want to make sure that businesses in the city continue to get customers going through them. So it's business as usual. Now, obviously, there will be some interruptions with the odd motorcade and things like that. But I've got to say that, you know, if you're in Brisbane City, I'd certainly encourage people to come into the town, and you know, if they want to try to see Barack Obama's motorcade go past, and they can do that.
All right, well, let's talk about the program. It really doesn't begin until tomorrow. There seems to be a bit of an international clamour, certainly a lot of questions about where climate change might sit, and the reason for that is, of course, obvious with what China and the US have done. How might that work in the mechanics of how the G20 operates? Can you make a big, bold statement on climate change when it really hasn't been a dominant theme of the year's work so far?
Well, we will be making a big, bold statement on jobs and growth, because that has been the central thrust for the Abbott government throughout the entirety of this year. We really want to make sure that the G20, as what is effectively the world's premier economic body, deals with what its primary charge is, and that's to deal with jobs and to deal with growth. Now, obviously, climate change is part of the tapestry of global growth, but it is a tapestry, and I think it's wrong to isolate any one particular thread. The fact is that we want to make sure that this is an outstanding success in terms of a leaders' summit. It builds on the great work that we've accomplished thus far. Climate change will be part of discussion. Some countries might raise it, but ultimately the real focus has been on that growth aspiration of additional 2%.
Do you think there's a lack of courtesy in a way of not having brought this by several powers, not really Australia, but others, not having brought this onto the G20 a little earlier, because you've got this spectacle now where you get a major leaders announcement in Beijing, and yet the Australian government is absolutely focused on, as you say, growth at this gathering?
Well, it's not just the Australian government, it's the G20.
Where do we go now?
G20 member states have been focused on our pledge to have an aspiration of additional 2% global growth. I mean, I think it's important we retain some context around this. An additional 2% of global growth and the nearly 1,000 or so reforms that countries have put forward about how they'll achieve that, that translates to an extra $2 trillion in the global economy. It translates to tens of millions of jobs. So I certainly don't want to see that lost because some people want to just focus on one particular aspect.
Fair enough. Well, let's talk about that $2 trillion and the 2%. There are plenty of economists out there saying it's not going to make it, not in 5 years anyway, because some countries are really struggling to get in anywhere near 3%, and you're looking to push them towards 5%, or the G20 is, not necessarily as straight. It's a big ask, isn't it?
Look, it is a big ask. It's, let's call it a stretch target. But the point is, though, that the Treasurer back in Sydney in February made it clear and got all the G20 member states to sign up to that aspiration of an additional 2%. Now, the modelling that's been done by the IMF and the OECD indicates, and we saw yesterday yesterday comments from the OECD President Engel, who indicated that we anticipate, with the reforms that have been put forward, to achieve growth of an additional 2.1%. So that is great news. Now, obviously, the real emphasis is on the execution of those reforms.
Now, all of that execution can be tracked and measured out over 5 years. Let's talk about a what if. What if they get nowhere near it? Is there reputational damage to the credibility of the G20 if this one just dissipates out into the ether over the next 5 years?
Well, I think that every member state has an obligation to follow through on the reforms that they've put forward. Australia's outlined our initiatives, other countries have outlined their initiatives. I mean, we really want the G20 to drive growth. We didn't want it to continue to drift. We didn't want it just to be a talk fest. We wanted it to drive global growth. And by driving global growth, we change people's lives. And that really is the power of the G20. So I think it will fall upon leaders of the various countries to say, this is what we're going to do, and we want to follow through on that. Now, obviously, if they fail to do that, then we'll see the repercussions in terms of domestic politics in each country.
But only in domestic politics. There's no punitive action or any suggestion of such action coming from this collective?
I mean, there is punitive action, because if countries don't follow through on these reforms, the people that ultimately face the consequences are the people of each particular country. And globally, we all suffer a little bit because we don't achieve that extra growth. I mean, that is the precise reason why we're saying let's go for growth. It's why we in Australia have an economic action strategy, and why we've got $125 billion of infrastructure that we're looking at rolling out, productive infrastructure, because all of us collectively want to make sure we start to pay down debt, and want to make sure that we start to grow the economy more strongly.
All right. Well, Steve Ciobo, you've got more duties out at the airport this afternoon, I believe. Is that right? Who's due in for you?
So World Trade Organisation president's flying in this afternoon, and there's a variety of other leaders as well. And of course, the Prime Minister, as you mentioned, Prime Minister Abbott and Prime Minister Cameron arrive in Brisbane this afternoon.
All right. Well, best of luck with your diplomacy, and thanks for joining us this afternoon.